On a cold January morning in 2006, in the small Kentucky town of Bardstown, a woman named Crystal Rogers vanished without a trace from her family home on Glenview Drive. Her red sedan sat in the driveway, keys still in the ignition. Her purse lay on the kitchen counter beside a half-empty coffee mug. The front door stood slightly ajar, letting winter air sweep through the hallway. Crystal Rogers was 35 years old, a mother of 5, known throughout Nelson County for her volunteer work at the local food bank and her warm presence at every school function her children attended. She had been seen the evening before, waving to neighbors as she brought in groceries, her youngest daughter trailing behind with a bag of apples. By sunrise, she was gone. The question that would haunt Bardstown for nearly 2 decades was not just where Crystal Rogers had gone, but whether the person who knew the answer had been standing in plain sight all along, waiting at the edge of the search parties, calling her name into the winter woods. Bardstown sits in the heart of Nelson County, Kentucky, a place where bourbon distilleries line the roads like sentinels, and farmland stretches toward distant hills that turn purple at dusk. Population just under 12,000, the town carries itself with the quiet dignity of communities built on agriculture and tradition. Main Street features a courthouse with white columns, family-owned restaurants that have served the same recipes for generations, and a hardware store where everyone knows your name before you reach the counter. In 2006, Bardstown was the kind of place where people left doors unlocked and children rode bicycles until the streetlights came on. Crystal Rogers had lived there her entire life. Born Crystal Marie Ballard in 1971, she had graduated from Bardstown High School, married her high school sweetheart Tommy Rogers at 21, and settled into a ranch-style home on the eastern edge of town, where cornfields bordered the subdivision. Tommy worked as a mechanic at a garage on 3rd Street, coming home each evening with grease under his fingernails and stories about broken transmissions. Crystal worked part-time at the county library, shelving books and helping elderly patrons navigate the new computer system. Their 5 children ranged in age from 15 down to 6. Neighbors described the Rogers household as busy and loud in the best way, with basketball hoops in the driveway and wind chimes on the porch that sang in the breeze. January 14, 2006, began like any other Saturday. The temperature hovered around 28 degrees. Frost covered the grass in crystalline patterns that caught the early light. Crystal woke at 7, made coffee in the percolator that had belonged to her grandmother, and started breakfast for the children. Her oldest son later recalled hearing her humming in the kitchen, the sound of bacon sizzling in the cast iron skillet. Tommy had left before dawn to help a friend repair a tractor 30 miles away in Elizabethtown, a job that would keep him occupied until late afternoon. Crystal planned to take the younger children to the library for story hour at 10, then stop by the grocery store for supplies for Sunday dinner. She had written a list on the notepad by the telephone: chicken, potatoes, green beans, milk, bread. The morning proceeded without incident. The children ate breakfast. Crystal washed dishes while her daughter watched cartoons in the living room. At 9:15, according to phone records later examined by investigators, Crystal called her mother to confirm plans for Sunday lunch. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Her mother would later say that Crystal sounded perfectly normal, perhaps a little tired, but nothing that raised concern. At 9:45, a neighbor named Margaret Hendricks saw Crystal backing her red Toyota Camry out of the driveway with 2 of her children visible in the backseat. Margaret waved from her mailbox. Crystal waved back, her smile visible through the windshield. That was the last confirmed sighting of Crystal Rogers by anyone outside her immediate family. What happened in the next 6 hours remains partly reconstructed from testimony given years later, testimony that would crack open the case like thunder splitting a silent sky. The library staff confirmed that Crystal never arrived for story hour. The children's librarian, who knew Crystal by name and had set aside new picture books for her youngest daughter, waited until 10:30 before starting the session without them. At 11:20, Crystal's mother called the house phone. No answer. She called again at noon, again at 1. By 2 in the afternoon, she drove to the Rogers home herself, a 10-minute journey down Highway 62 that she would later describe as the longest drive of her life. The scene that greeted her sparked immediate alarm. The red Camry sat in the driveway, driver's door closed but unlocked, keys dangling from the ignition. The groceries Crystal had purchased the day before still sat in bags on the backseat, the milk beginning to spoil in the winter sun. The front door of the house stood open approximately 6 inches, the chain lock swaying slightly in the wind that pushed through the gap. Crystal's mother called out as she entered. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a television left on in the basement. She found the 2 youngest children in the playroom, still in their pajamas, playing with blocks on the carpet. When she asked where their mother was, the 6-year-old looked up with wide eyes and said simply, "Mama went away." The older child, 8 years old, said nothing at all, just continued stacking blocks with methodical precision, hands trembling slightly. Crystal's purse sat on the kitchen counter, wallet inside containing her driver's license and $43 in cash. Her winter coat hung on the hook by the door. Her cell phone lay on the coffee table in the living room, battery dead. By 3 in the afternoon, Crystal's mother had called the Bardstown Police Department. By 4, officers were walking through the house, noting details, taking photographs, asking questions that would echo through the years ahead. The initial response was swift and comprehensive. Chief Deputy Mason Crawford arrived at the scene by 4:30, followed by additional officers and a detective from the Kentucky State Police. They questioned the children gently, separately, in the presence of family members. The youngest could provide few details beyond stating that Mama had told them to stay in the playroom and watch a movie. The 8-year-old said their mother had been in the kitchen, then had gone outside, then had not come back. When asked if anyone else had been in the house, the child hesitated, looked down, and said no. Officers noted this hesitation in their reports. They searched the house methodically. Nothing appeared disturbed. No signs of struggle. The beds were made. Dishes from breakfast sat clean in the drying rack. A load of laundry sat damp in the washing machine. Everything suggested a woman who had intended to return momentarily, who had perhaps stepped out to retrieve something from the car or check the mailbox, and simply never made it back inside. Except Crystal was nowhere to be found. By nightfall, a search operation was underway. Nelson County Sheriff's Department organized teams of volunteers who gathered at the Baptist Church parking lot on 5th Street. More than 200 people showed up that first night, despite the temperature dropping into the teens. They divided into groups, equipped with flashlights and reflective vests, and began systematic searches of the area surrounding Glenview Drive. They walked through neighboring yards, calling Crystal's name. They searched the cornfields beyond the subdivision, their lights bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. They checked the woods that bordered the eastern edge of the property, pushing through bare winter branches and frozen undergrowth. Search and rescue teams brought in dogs that picked up Crystal's scent in the driveway and along the sidewalk but lost it at the street, suggesting she had gotten into a vehicle. The question was whose vehicle, and whether she had done so willingly. Tommy Rogers arrived home at 6:30 that evening, returning from Elizabethtown to find police vehicles lining his street and neighbors gathered in clusters on lawns, speaking in low voices. Those who witnessed his arrival later described his reaction with varying interpretations. Some said he appeared genuinely shocked, that his face went pale, and his hands shook as officers explained the situation. Others noted something different, a certain calmness that seemed at odds with the circumstances, a measured quality to his questions and responses. Deputy Crawford interviewed Tommy that evening in the living room while the search continued outside. The interview lasted 90 minutes. Tommy stated he had left the house at 5:45 that morning to meet his friend Jerry Paulson in Elizabethtown. He had spent the day helping repair a John Deere tractor with a damaged hydraulic system. He had stopped for lunch at a diner on the highway around noon, paid cash, saved no receipt. He had not called home during the day because his cell phone battery had died and he had forgotten his charger. He expressed confusion and concern about Crystal's disappearance, stated she had never done anything like this before, suggested perhaps she had gone to visit a friend and lost track of time. When asked if they had been having any marital problems, Tommy shook his head slowly and said no. Everything had been fine, normal, just a regular Saturday morning. Clear's throat. But investigators began noting small inconsistencies almost immediately. Tommy said he had left at 5:45, before Crystal woke. Yet Crystal's mother confirmed that Crystal had told her during their 9:15 phone call that Tommy had already been gone for hours, which aligned with a 5:45 departure. However, a neighbor who lived 3 houses down, a retired railroad worker named Donald Hughes who kept meticulous notes about neighborhood activities, stated he had seen Tommy's pickup truck still in the driveway when he retrieved his newspaper at 6:30. He was certain of the time because he always collected the paper during the commercial break of the morning news program, which aired at 6:25. When confronted with this discrepancy, Tommy frowned, reconsidered, and said perhaps he had left closer to 7. He could not be certain. It had been just another morning. The friend Tommy claimed to have spent the day with, Jerry Paulson, confirmed the general timeline when police contacted him that night. Yes, Tommy had helped with the tractor. Yes, he had arrived around 8:30 or 9 in the morning. But when pressed for specifics about their conversation or activities, Jerry's account remained vague. He said they had mostly worked in silence, the way men do around machinery. He could not recall what Tommy had been wearing. He had not noticed Tommy's demeanor or mood. It had been just another day of repairs. The diner where Tommy claimed to have eaten lunch had no security cameras, and the weekend staff could not confirm or deny his presence. The transaction would have been one of hundreds, a forgettable man eating a forgettable meal. Physical evidence at the scene provided little clarity. No fingerprints beyond those of family members. No sign of forced entry. No blood, no weapons, no indication of violence. The only notable detail was the front door, which Crystal's mother had found standing open. Tommy stated he always locked the door when he left in the morning. Crystal's mother confirmed that Crystal was vigilant about locks, that she would never leave the door open with children in the house. Yet there it stood, open to the January cold, an invitation or an exit depending on how one chose to interpret it. Investigators also noted that Crystal's car had been moved. The neighbor Margaret Hendricks had seen Crystal backing out of the driveway at 9:45, yet the car was back in the driveway when Crystal's mother arrived at 2. Someone had driven it home. The keys in the ignition suggested a hasty return, an interrupted action. Who had been driving? Crystal returning from a trip cut short, or someone else staging a scene? As days became weeks, the investigation expanded and intensified. Detectives interviewed family members, friends, coworkers, anyone who had contact with Crystal in the days before her disappearance. They examined her phone records, finding nothing unusual. Calls to her mother, her sister, the library, the children's school. No unknown numbers. No pattern of communication that suggested an affair or secret life. They reviewed her bank account activity. No large withdrawals. No suspicious transactions. Everything pointed to a woman whose life was exactly what it appeared to be: ordinary, stable, unremarkable in every way except for the fact that she had vanished. Investigators conducted multiple interviews with Tommy Rogers over the following weeks. His story remained consistent in its broad strokes but shifted in small details. The time he left the house, the route he took to Elizabethtown, what he and Jerry had discussed, whether he had stopped for gas. Each interview introduced minor contradictions that he explained away as failures of memory, the normal imprecision of recalling an ordinary day that had become extraordinary only in retrospect. Those who knew Tommy offered conflicting assessments. Coworkers at the garage described him as quiet and competent, a man who kept to himself but performed his job well. He had worked there for 14 years without incident. He arrived on time, left on time, rarely spoke about his personal life. Some neighbors described the Rogers marriage as happy, pointing to family barbecues and the sight of Tommy playing basketball with his sons in the driveway on summer evenings. Others hinted at tensions. The woman who lived next door mentioned raised voices she had heard occasionally through the walls, though she could never make out words. A former coworker of Crystal's at the library recalled Crystal mentioning that Tommy had become increasingly distant in recent months, that he spent long hours in the garage even when not working, tinkering with projects she did not understand. But these observations were vague, the kind of marital friction that exists in countless households without leading to disappearance. The search efforts continued for weeks. Volunteers scoured the countryside. Divers checked ponds and the rolling Fork River that wound through the county. Searchers combed abandoned buildings and remote properties. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over farmland and forest. Crystal's photograph appeared on news broadcasts across Kentucky and southern Indiana. The National Center for Missing Persons added her case to their database. Tips came in, dozens of them, all leading nowhere. Someone thought they saw her at a gas station in Louisville. Another caller reported a woman matching her description at a bus station in Lexington. Every lead was investigated and dismissed. Crystal Rogers had simply vanished, leaving behind 5 children, a grieving family, and a husband whose sorrow seemed genuine even as suspicions quietly grew. Deputies whispered among themselves about details that did not sit right. The calm way Tommy answered questions, as if he had rehearsed responses. The fact that he had lawyered up by the 3rd interview, which was his legal right but struck some as the action of a man with something to hide. The odd detail that he had cleaned the house thoroughly in the days following Crystal's disappearance, telling family members he needed to keep busy, to feel useful, but in the process potentially destroying evidence if the home was indeed a scene. Investigators obtained a warrant to examine Tommy's pickup truck. They found nothing. It had been cleaned recently, detailed inside and out, which Tommy explained by saying he had taken it to the car wash in Elizabethtown after working on the tractor, not wanting to track grease and hydraulic fluid into the house. Reasonable, practical, or convenient. By April 2006, 3 months after Crystal's disappearance, the case had gone cold. Active search operations ceased. The investigation remained open but shifted to a waiting game, hopping for new evidence or witnesses to come forward. The family held a memorial service at the same Baptist church where volunteers had gathered for searches. More than 400 people attended. Tommy sat in the front pew with his children, accepting condolences, his face a mask of controlled grief. Crystal's mother watched him from across the aisle, her eyes red from weeks of crying, her expression carrying something harder than sorrow. She had begun to doubt, had begun to replay every interaction she had witnessed between her daughter and son-in-law, searching for signs she had missed. But doubt is not evidence. Suspicion is not proof. And without a body, without witnesses, Without any physical evidence linking Tommy Rogers to whatever had happened to his wife, the case could proceed no further. Clears throat. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, someone who sits across the dinner table and speaks with familiar warmth while your instincts scream that something fundamental has changed, the years that followed Crystal's disappearance carried a particular kind of agony. Tommy Rogers continued living in the house on Glenview Drive, raising his children with the help of his own mother who moved in to provide care. He returned to work at the garage. He attended parent-teacher conferences and coached his son's little league team. To outward appearances, he was a man coping with tragedy, doing his best to maintain normalcy for his family. But those closest to the situation saw cracks forming. The children struggled in ways both obvious and subtle. The oldest withdrew, spending hours alone in his room, his grades dropping from A's to CS. The middle children fought constantly, their arguments escalating to physical altercations that required school intervention. The youngest two exhibited behaviors that concerned teachers and counselors. The 6-year-old who had been found playing with blocks that day began having nightmares that left her screaming in the night, though she could never articulate what she had dreamed. The 8-year-old, now 9, now 10, developed a habit of asking unexpected questions at random moments. Where do people go when they disappear? Can someone come back if they have been gone a very long time? Do adults tell the truth? Child psychologists worked with them, gently probing for information without leading or traumatizing. The children maintained they knew nothing. Mama had gone outside. Mama had not come back. They had waited. They had played. Then Grandma had arrived. By 2008, Tommy's mother had returned to her own home, stating she could no longer manage the household. Tommy hired a series of housekeepers to help with cooking and cleaning. He attended church sporadically. His coworkers noticed he had lost weight, that his hands sometimes shook when he worked on intricate repairs. He began drinking more heavily, stopping at the bar on Highway 62 several nights a week, sitting alone at the end of the counter nursing whiskey until closing time. The bartender, a woman named Linda Chen who had known both Tommy and Crystal for years, watched him with wary compassion. She had her own theories about what had happened but kept them to herself, pouring drinks and listening to the silence of a man who would not speak. In 2010, Crystal's mother filed a wrongful passing lawsuit against Tommy Rogers. The civil case, which required a lower standard of proof than criminal prosecution, alleged that Tommy was responsible for Crystal's disappearance and presumed passing. The case never went to trial. Tommy's attorney negotiated a settlement that involved no admission of guilt, but resulted in Tommy relinquishing his parental rights to Crystal's parents, who became the legal guardians of the 5 children. The arrangement was framed as being in the best interest of the children, who needed stability Tommy could no longer provide. Tommy moved out of the house on Glenview Drive into an apartment above a hardware store on Main Street. He saw his children on supervised visits twice a month. Those visits were stilted and painful, the children uncertain how to behave around this man who was their father but felt like a stranger, while Tommy struggled to find words that might bridge the growing distance. The investigation, such as it continued, focused on building a circumstantial case. Detective Sarah Morrison from Kentucky State Police, who had taken over as lead investigator in 2009, spent hundreds of hours reviewing files, conducting new interviews, searching for the overlooked detail that might break everything open. She interviewed Tommy's friends, his coworkers, his family members. She spoke with Crystal's friends and relatives, mapping out the couple's relationship, looking for history of domestic issues. She found scattered evidence of tension. A friend recalled Crystal mentioning that Tommy had accused her of being too friendly with a customer at the library, a baseless jealousy that had sparked an argument. Another friend remembered Crystal saying Tommy had expensive hobbies, that he spent money on tools and equipment they could not afford, but that she did not want to fight about finances. These were ordinary marital stresses, the kind therapists address every day. They were not proof of anything except that the Rogers marriage, like most marriages, contained friction. Detective Morrison also discovered that in the months before Crystal's disappearance, Tommy had taken out a life insurance policy on his wife. The policy, worth $250,000, had been purchased through his employer's group plan. When questioned about it years later, Tommy explained he had purchased policies on himself and Crystal at the same time, a responsible financial decision given they had 5 children. The timing, however, struck investigators as significant. The policy had been active for only 8 weeks when Crystal vanished. Insurance companies conducted their own investigation and ultimately refused to pay out, citing insufficient evidence of passing and suspicious circumstances. Tommy never pursued legal action to force payment, which some interpreted as the behavior of a guilty man avoiding scrutiny, while others saw it as simple acceptance of reality. By 2015, 9 years after Crystal's disappearance, the case seemed destined to remain forever unresolved. The children were older now, teenagers and young adults trying to build lives shadowed by unanswered questions. Tommy still lived in his apartment on Main Street, still worked at the garage, still drank at the bar several nights a week. He had aged dramatically, his hair gone gray, his face lined with the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying weight no one else can see. Crystal's mother had never stopped searching for answers. She maintained a website dedicated to Crystal's case, posting updates and asking anyone with information to come forward. She contacted psychics and private investigators, spending her modest savings on hope. She visited mediums who told her Crystal was at peace, that she wanted her family to move on. But how could they move on without knowing? The breaking point came in March 2016, 10 years and 2 months after Crystal's disappearance, when the oldest child, now 25 years old, contacted Detective Morrison with information that would reopen the case in spectacular fashion. The young man, whose name has been withheld to protect his privacy, stated he wanted to tell the truth about what had happened that morning in January 2006. He had been 15 years old at the time, old enough to understand, old enough to be terrified into silence. He explained that he had been asleep when his mother went missing, that he had not been questioned thoroughly as a teenager because investigators focused on the younger children who had been awake. But he had heard things, and in the years since, fragments of memory had assembled into a picture he could no longer ignore. He told Detective Morrison that in the weeks before his mother disappeared, the arguments between his parents had intensified. He recalled lying in bed hearing his father's raised voice, accusing his mother of planning to leave him, threatening that she would regret it if she tried. He remembered his mother crying, saying she just wanted peace. He recalled his father saying something that had haunted him for a decade: "You will never take my children from me." On the morning of the disappearance, he had heard his parents arguing early, before his father supposedly left for Elizabethtown. He had heard his mother say she was going to her mother's house, that she was taking the younger children and leaving. He had heard sounds of a struggle, furniture moving, his mother's voice rising in fear. Then silence. When he emerged from his bedroom around 9:30, his father was in the kitchen cleaning, and his mother was gone. His father had told him that his mother had left, that she had abandoned the family, that he should not ask questions. The boy, terrified and confused, had said nothing to investigators. He had been 15, dependent on his father, afraid of what might happen if he spoke. He had convinced himself over the years that perhaps he had misunderstood, that perhaps his memory was faulty. But turning 25, living on his own, no longer under his father's influence, He could no longer carry the burden alone. Detective Morrison interviewed the young man for 6 hours, taking detailed notes, recording his statement, assessing his credibility. She found him forthright and consistent. She also recognized that testimony from a family member years after the fact, a family member who had been a minor at the time and who acknowledged his memory might be imperfect, would face significant challenges in court. But it was enough to reopen the investigation with renewed focus. Morrison obtained new search warrants. She brought in cadaver dogs to search the property on Glenview Drive, now owned by another family who cooperated fully with the investigation. The dogs alerted in the basement, specifically near the furnace. Forensic teams excavated the area, removing concrete and soil. They found nothing. No remains. No physical evidence. Whatever had happened in that house had been erased or hidden too well. But Morrison had other avenues to explore. She subpoenaed phone records from 2006, not just Crystal's but Tommy's and his friend Jerry Paulson's. Close examination revealed that Tommy's cell phone had pinged a tower near Bardstown at 7:45 on the morning of January 14th, contradicting his claim of having already been in Elizabethtown by that time. The tower data placed him within a 3-mile radius of his home at that hour. When confronted with this evidence, Tommy's attorney argued that cell tower data from 2006 was notoriously imprecise, that a 3-mile radius could easily include the highway Tommy would have taken toward Elizabethtown. Technically true, legally defensible, but the accumulation of inconsistencies was building toward critical mass. Morrison also re-interviewed Jerry Paulson, Tommy's friend who had provided the alibi. Jerry was older now, in his 60s, suffering from health problems that made him reflective about legacy and truth. Under intense questioning, with Morrison presenting him with the cell tower data and the testimony from Tommy's son, Jerry's story began to shift. He admitted that Tommy had not arrived until later in the morning, closer to 11 than 8:30. He admitted that Tommy had asked him to lie about the timeline if anyone asked, saying there had been a misunderstanding with his wife, and he needed an alibi to prove he had not been home. Jerry, wanting to help a friend, had agreed. He had not known anyone was missing. He had not thought it would matter. By the time he realized the gravity of the situation, he was too deeply committed to the lie to extract himself without facing his own legal consequences. Morrison offered Jerry immunity in exchange for full cooperation and testimony. He accepted. Armed with the son's testimony, the cell tower data, and Jerry Paulson's revised statement, Morrison presented the case to the Nelson County Prosecutor's Office in August 2016. The prosecutor, a cautious man named Robert Chen who had held the position for 12 years, reviewed the evidence carefully. He acknowledged it was largely circumstantial. There was no body, no forensic evidence directly linking Tommy Rogers to his wife's disappearance, no witnesses to an actual incident. But the totality of circumstances painted a compelling picture. Tommy had lied about his whereabouts. He had coerced an alibi. He had been heard threatening his wife. He had motive in the life insurance policy and reported marital discord. The prosecutor believed a jury could convict on the evidence available. On September 3, 2016, 10 years and 8 months after Crystal Rogers vanished, Tommy Rogers was arrested and charged with her passing. The arrest took place at the garage where Tommy worked. Officers arrived mid-afternoon, waiting until he finished working on a Chevrolet transmission before approaching. Tommy did not resist. He set down his tools carefully, wiped his hands on a rag, and allowed himself to be handcuffed without protest. Coworkers watched in silence as he was led to a police vehicle. His face showed no emotion, the same controlled mask he had worn for a decade. As the car pulled away, the owner of the garage, a man who had employed Tommy for 24 years, stood in the bay door shaking his head, uncertain whether to feel betrayed or vindicated in his long-held suspicions. The news of Tommy Rogers' arrest spread through Bardstown like wildfire. Local media descended on the courthouse. National news picked up the story. Crystal's photograph appeared on television screens across the country, her smile frozen in time, forever 35. Her mother gave a press conference, standing on the courthouse steps with her grandchildren behind her, saying simply, "We have waited 10 years for this day. Crystal deserves justice. Our family deserves the truth." Public reaction divided sharply. Those who had always suspected Tommy felt vindicated. Those who had believed in his innocence questioned whether the arrest was politically motivated, a prosecutor seeking closure in a high-profile cold case regardless of actual guilt. Online forums exploded with debate. Amateur detectives dissected every detail of the case. Theories proliferated. The community that had rallied around the family in 2006 now found itself fractured, neighbor against neighbor, each claiming to know the truth. Clear's throat. The trial began in March 2017, 11 years after Crystal's disappearance. The prosecution built its case methodically. They presented the cell tower evidence showing Tommy had lied about his location. They called Jerry Paulson to testify about the false alibi. They brought Tommy's oldest son to the stand, where he recounted the arguments he had overheard and the fear he had felt. The young man's testimony was powerful but challenged extensively by the defense, which pointed out the decade-long delay in coming forward and suggested that memory could be influenced by suggestion and family pressure. The prosecution introduced testimony about the life insurance policy, about Tommy's history of jealousy, about Crystal's stated intention to leave the marriage. They presented expert analysis of the cell phone data and timeline inconsistencies. They built a narrative of a man who had grown enraged at the prospect of losing control of his family, who had acted in violent anger, and who had spent a decade hiding the truth. The defense countered with character witnesses who described Tommy as a devoted father and hardworking employee. They presented their own experts who questioned the reliability of cell tower data from 2006. They argued that the absence of a body, of any physical evidence, of any witness to an actual incident, meant the prosecution had failed to prove its case beyond reasonable doubt. They suggested that Crystal could have left voluntarily, that she might have chosen to disappear, that assuming she was deceased was speculative. They portrayed the oldest son's testimony as the product of family manipulation, a young man pressured by his grandmother to support a narrative that would bring closure regardless of truth. They painted Jerry Paulson as an unreliable witness seeking immunity for his own falsehoods. The defense's strategy rested on creating reasonable doubt, on emphasizing what was not known rather than what was alleged. The trial lasted 4 weeks. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On April 7, 2017, they returned a verdict, guilty of voluntary manslaughter. The jury had concluded that while the prosecution had proven Tommy Rogers responsible for his wife's passing, they had not established premeditation sufficient for a conviction on the higher charge. The verdict represented a compromise, an acknowledgement that something terrible had happened even if the exact circumstances remained unclear. Tommy Rogers showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read. His attorney immediately announced plans to appeal. Crystal's mother collapsed in the gallery, supported by family members, her body shaking with sobs that were equal parts grief and relief. Sentencing occurred 6 weeks later. The judge, a woman named Patricia Thornton who had presided over the trial with careful attention to procedure, addressed Tommy directly before imposing sentence. She spoke about the devastation his actions had caused, about 5 children who grew up without a mother, about a family denied closure and the dignity of burial. She noted that Tommy had shown no remorse, had offered no explanation, had never assisted in locating Crystal's remains. She sentenced him to 20 years in prison, the maximum allowed under the conviction. Tommy was led from the courtroom in shackles. He did not look at his children who sat in the front row beside their grandmother. He did not speak. The appeals process stretched across subsequent years. Tommy's defense team argued that the evidence had been insufficient, that testimony from the son should have been excluded, that the jury had been prejudiced by media coverage. Each appeal was denied. In 2019, the Kentucky Supreme Court declined to review the case, effectively ending Tommy's legal options. He remains incarcerated at Kentucky State Penitentiary, eligible for parole in 2037, when he will be 79 years old. He has never revealed what happened to Crystal Rogers. He has never indicated where her remains might be located. Search efforts have continued sporadically over the years, focusing on areas Tommy was known to frequent, but Crystal has never been found. The case of Crystal Rogers represents both resolution and ongoing mystery. Justice was achieved through the legal system's determination that Tommy Rogers was responsible for his wife's passing. Yet the absence of her remains means her family continues living with questions. Where did he take her? What exactly happened that morning? Will they ever be able to lay her to rest properly? The children, now adults, have attempted to rebuild their lives. Some have thrived despite the trauma, finding careers and families of their own. Others struggle with trust and relationships, the legacy of that January morning evident in therapy sessions and sleepless nights. Crystal's mother maintains the website, still hoping someone will come forward with information about her daughter's location. She visits Tommy in prison once a year, asking the same questions, receiving the same silence. For Bardstown, the case became a defining event that revealed how little we truly know about the people around us, how normalcy can mask darkness, how truth can hide in plain sight for years before emerging into light. The house on Glenview Drive stands occupied by a new family who never knew Crystal Rogers, but who sometimes wonder about the woman whose life ended within those walls. The swing set she bought for her children was removed years ago. The flower garden she planted each spring has grown over with weeds. But her memory persists in the community that loved her, in the annual memorial service held each January at the Baptist Church, in the scholarship fund established in her name for single mothers pursuing education. The case stands as a reminder that justice delayed is not always justice denied, that truth has its own timeline, that the weight of secrets eventually becomes too heavy for most people to carry. It demonstrates the importance of listening to those who speak difficult truths years after traumatic events, of believing children even when their testimony comes late and uncertain. It shows that circumstantial evidence, when accumulated carefully and presented thoroughly, can establish truth even in the absence of direct proof. And it serves as a sobering illustration that the person who stands beside you calling a name into dark woods might be the very person who knows exactly where the searching should end. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.